This is really an important topic. We wanted to get this in before, if y'all want to come on up, guys, Mark Hart and Captain Hogston and Lieutenant Hargreaves, if y'all would. This is so pertinent to, tornadoes in the west and floods in the east. So this presentation, I really look forward, and that's why we tried to push it and shuffle around things to get them on the agenda today. So gentlemen, please, if you can, introduce yourselves for the record and make sure that green light's on.
All right,
the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to mention Representative Wheatley is the primary co-sponsor and working with us on this. We left him off the agenda, so I wanted to give him a shout out. But with me today I have Captain Ryan Hogston and Lieutenant Hargreaves of the Lexington Fire Department. Both are two of the leading experts in urban search and rescue in the state of Kentucky. Both have been and are members of the Ohio Task Force 1 FEMA USAR team. And just to give you a brief introduction, Lieutenant Hargreaves has stepped back from that when he assumed the role as Executive Officer of Special Operations for Lexington Fire Department. However, Captain Hogston is currently still a member of Ohio Task Force 1. And just to give you an example of his experience and some of them he's had, a lot of you will remember the condo collapse in Surfside, Florida a year or so ago. Well, Captain Hogston was one of the rescue team managers on that incident. So with that, I'm going to let Representative Wheatley make a real quick statement, and then we're going to turn it over to Captain Hogston and Lieutenant Hargreaves.
Thank you, Representative Hart, Representative Buddy Wheatley, 65th District. I've had myself quite a few experiences related to search and rescue, and one major one shortly after 9/11 when I was incident commander of a major collapse in Covington. And the first thing we were doing is we were preparing for that collapse. We knew it was going to happen. It was a 1860s building which had a odd roof structure, and we said, "Is there a USAR team available?" And this was shortly after 9/11 when USAR teams became more well known in the area or in the country, and we did not. But since that time, there's been development. These gentlemen have been part of it, and I look forward to being part of this team. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you for the opportunity to come to speak to your committee. Good morning. Like we mentioned earlier, my name is Ryan Hogston. I'm a captain with the Lexington Fire Department. Just a little bit of information about us for our introductions. Some of our experience that we've had over the years. I'm currently a 30-year member of the Kentucky Fire Service, 27, almost 28 now with Lexington Fire. I've been 17 years with Ohio Task Force 1, which is a FEMA urban search and rescue team, and I serve as a task force leader there. Been on multiple statewide and deployments throughout the nation also. Most recently, Hurricane Ian, that just happened last month. I was a task force leader and brought Ohio Task Force 1 from Ohio to Florida and back. We did 10 days of work down there. Like Representative Hart mentioned, I also was a part of Surfside, the collapse. Most recently for us in Kentucky, I was a part of the floodings and also the Mayfield operations night manager during the Mayfield at the candle factory. And that's me. I'm going to introduce Lieutenant Hargreaves, and he can speak.
Good morning. My name is Lieutenant Doug Hargreaves. I'm the Executive Officer of Special Operations within the Lexington Fire Department. A little bit about myself is 30 years of fire service here in Kentucky. 18 of those years were with Special Operations, mostly with urban search and rescue. Also, I was a member of Ohio Task Force for about 5 years. Again, I stepped back to take different roles in the Lexington Fire Department. Again, multiple national and statewide deployments. Some of those including Hurricane Irene, the candle factory in Mayfield, Kentucky, Clay City flooding, mudslide collapse in Stanton, Kentucky, and then also just recently East Kentucky flooding. Also during the East Kentucky flooding, I was a statewide operations manager in Hazard, starting the second week. And just this past year, presented on behalf of Kentucky at the State Urban Search and Rescue Conference in South Carolina.
So we're going to continue on. Next slide, please. We're going to continue on and go with what is urban search and rescue, all right, and urban search and rescue in Kentucky and how it affects us. So we're going to see these next few topics that you see here. We're going to see in the next few slides. Next slide, please. All right, so what is urban search and rescue? Urban search and rescue is a type of technical rescue operation that involves the highly trained and organized teams. These teams can locate, extricate, and provide initial medical stabilization of victims trapped in an urban and rural area. Once described as mainly a team for structural collapses due to natural disasters, war, terrorism, or accidents, teams today are used in all types of disasters. They're known and organized as all hazards team that follow FEMA guidelines. With this, why do we call it urban versus rural or whatever, right? The reason the term urban search and rescue comes in is it's a FEMA acronym. It's a FEMA recognized area. So it means basically not wilderness. It means anything but wilderness rescue, okay? So that's what we're looking through there. So it's not just for cities or small towns or big towns. It's for the urban setting, not the wilderness setting. And that's what we want to make sure when we hear urban search and rescue that that's what we're talking about.
So what are the capabilities, What are the capabilities of a task force? One is physical search and rescue operations in damaged collapsed structures, emergency medical care for entombed survivors, also task force personnel and search canines, reconnaissance to assess damage and needs to provide feedback to local, state, tribal, territorial, and federal officials, assessment and shut off of utilities of houses and buildings, and also hazardous materials surveys and evaluations. One of the things that we were proud of in Breathitt County was that we surveyed over 5,000 structures and waypoints, bridges, and such during that first week of the flooding. Those assessments started at the very first rescue that we were making. We were also plotting damage assessments. Structural hazard evaluations of buildings needed for immediate occupancy to support disasters and relief operations. Stabilizing damaged structures, including shoring and cribbing operations on damaged buildings. Hazard materials, equipment, push packages for operations in contaminated environment. And then also search and rescue operations in water environments. During our first day of rescues in Breathitt County, we were able to rescue over 85 people via boat on just one road alone. That was with the assistance of Kentucky Fish and Wildlife, Winchester Fire Department, Lexington Fire Department, and also Wolfe County Rescue Squad. So why urban search and rescue? One is flooding. Kentucky is prone for flooding. Tornadoes, where tornadoes now is starting to be more of an issue here in Kentucky. Potential for earthquakes. Hurricanes, as we will not see much hurricanes, but we do see the aftermath of the rainstorms that come from hurricanes. Also ice storms, and then infrastructure collapses. And then also something we will add into there is terrorism. So some interesting facts that we have is that if you look at the two graphs that we have, one is 2021, the other one is 2022. This is the actual tornadoes that touched down in Kentucky during these 2 years. The trend has been to start in the southwest part of the state and move more towards the northeast travel, coming to Louisville, crossing Bowling Green, Frankfort, and then also Lexington and such.
Sorry. Thank you. So this here, earthquake risk. Obviously, Kentucky is on the New Madrid fault line. In 2014, a capstone was done with the state of Kentucky and several other states to go through and do a mock exercise if the New Madrid fault had an earthquake. Is what we're seeing here. When we did this capstone, this exercise, we saw that we'd have what they call the liquefaction of Western Kentucky. Basically, all the moisture in the ground would be shook up, and it would flood and cause flooding in that area. Like Lieutenant Hargraves mentioned, we also have flooding area. This is a graph that you see on the right-hand side with the history there. It's showing floods from 1996 to 2020. Kentucky was ranked 5th in flooding deaths for that. If you look in the bottom of that area there, even though Kentucky is a little over 1% of the population between 1996 and 2020, the state accounted for over 4% of the total flood deaths that happened across the United States. So some of the history of USAR in Kentucky. Since 2010, it's estimated that over 180 firefighters have received this highly skilled certification and training. These firefighters stretch from the state all over the state. These cities include from Paducah to Ashland and Louisville to Campbellsville. A committee formed and tried for 5 years, 2012 to 17, to make this much-needed statewide team a reality. First responders travel to connecting states and join their federal or state teams. In the last 12 months alone in Kentucky, we've had 2 historic disasters that were the largest tornado in Kentucky's history, killing 80, and a 1,000-year flood, killing 39. What I want to say in this, even though we do have highly trained personnel in the state of Kentucky, many of these members that are in the Commonwealth of Kentucky are on other state teams, such as Ohio or Tennessee. Mm-hmm. This is a pretty telling fact here. If you look at all the colors, we'll explain what it is. Kentucky, being there in the south that you see, is considered white. All the states around it are either blue or yellow. If you look at the blue-colored states, those are all states that have federal USAR teams, which means FEMA is controlled by them. The states in the yellow or the light yellow that you see are all the states that have state teams across the United States. As you can see, out of the 50 states, well, 48 that you see there, but out of the 50 states, there are 43 states that have some type of state team. And we are the only team in the South that does not have a state team. All right, so why is that important to Kentucky? Why would that be important for us? One of the things that we look for is if there's a major disaster in Kentucky, we're asking for our partners to help us, right? If there's a major disaster like the New Madrid fault that we talked about earlier, there's going to be disaster not just in Kentucky, but in Ohio, Illinois, Missouri, all those areas, and a lot of places have a lot more population density than Kentucky. If something like that were to happen, Kentucky would not have the resources to be able to save our own, let alone the people around us. So this is just an important graph for you to see what it takes for the teams around us. Go ahead, next slide. So how would a USAR program work in Kentucky? Evaluation of the current and past Kentucky response systems. This has been an ongoing process ever since September 11th, 2001. First thing we'd want to do is define a mission statement. Develop an accredited program that should be a standalone division under the umbrella of a larger entity. The most ideal spot that we come up with would be under the Kentucky Emergency Management. However, it could fit under any agency that has a responsibility of response. We wanted to develop an accredited response teams that are strategically placed throughout the state with different levels of training and capabilities. So our mission statement that we see, our mission statement. The mission of the Kentucky Urban Search and Rescue Program is the coordination, development, and maintenance of the state effort to provide resources to locate and extricate victims entrapped by man-made or natural disasters, as well as conduct other life-saving operations with integrity, courage, and dedication, maintaining unified leadership with a sustainable organizational structure. Mm-hmm.
As we talk about accredited USAR program and teams in Kentucky, VMAPPS, which is the Emergency Management Accreditation Program, is the voluntary standards assessment and accreditation process for disaster preparedness programs throughout the country, which fosters excellence and accountability in emergency management and homeland security programs. During the development of our program, the stages of the USAR program would follow the 44 standards that apply to USAR resources as they relate to VMAPPS certification. Of those standards, they cover program management, finance, planning and procedures, incident management, alert and mobilization, training and exercises, and resource management and logistics. Also, the Kentucky USAR program would have oversight of the regional teams and task forces. It would provide financial responsibility over task force and regional teams. It would provide a uniform training for each of the teams. This organization component would allow the entire state to be trained as one. It would allow for standardization on what equipment is purchased, how it is distributed, and would be consistent. This would allow volunteer and paid departments a resource for assistance and expertise. Also, this would allow for the statewide response teams at the hands of the governor, Kentucky Emergency Management, local emergency managers, and others to call upon when the disaster strikes. So with this, Kentucky would need it. The Kentucky USAR program would have several positions. One would be a Kentucky USAR program director, an assistant director of operations, assistant director of planning, 4 part-time training officers, assistant director of logistics with 4 part-time logistics officers, a program finance officer, and a program administrative assistant.
So how would a USAR program work in Kentucky? Well, first thing we'd want to do is to establish a Type 1 team. These teams consist of several areas of responsibility: search, rescue, hazmat, medical, planning, safety, and then canines. They are highly skilled structural collapse and all-hazard rescue, and they work for a 24-hour cycle. They can be deployed for up to 14 days, and they would be 3 days self-sufficient. FEMA model for this is a 70-person for a Type 1 team. The Type 1 task force would be a 3 deep in these positions, so 210 total people. This is following the FEMA guidelines. So the reason we would do this is that if FEMA teams had to come back into the state like they did for the tornadoes and for the flooding, we could work seamlessly together with a federal team. Next would be to develop and establish a Type 3 team that would consist of several areas of responsibility. Once again, search, rescue, hazmat, medical, planning, safety, and canines. These are highly skilled structural collapse and all-hazard rescue technicians, and they work for 12-hour cycles. They're deployed, once again, for up to 14 days and 3 days self-sufficient. FEMA model for this is 35 personnel for a Type 3 team. We try to do 3 deep in each one of those positions to make sure that we have coverage for this area. As we talked about with the Type 1 team, I missed over that. In the Type 1 team, we'd want to put that in somewhere in central Kentucky. And the Type 3 team, we're talking about the Louisville, Jefferson County area for those areas. So the task force response times, if we look at those both in Lexington area and central Kentucky and then the Louisville area, what we can see is where these teams could go to in a 2-hour range. All right, 2-hour response time. So we're seeing that we're covering most of the eastern and central part of Kentucky and started into the western part of the Kentucky. The one to the right that you see is a 6 and 8 hour response time. So the question is going to be, why would a Kentucky team go outside of the state to assist? Just like we saw in the tornadoes and once again in the flooding here in eastern Kentucky this past year, we had several members from different states coming to help us. This puts us within that 6-hour time frame that we could go and help the associated states that you see there. One thing for note, within that 6-8 hour time frame, we're looking at the majority of the population of the eastern part of the United States that our team could go and assist if needed. So how would the USAR team, or USAR program work in Kentucky? We'd also want to establish 10 regional teams. All right, these teams consist of several areas of responsibility, including search and rescue for a Type 1 heavy rescue team, swiftwater rescue, a Type 2 swiftwater team. These are highly skilled all-hazard responders that work for the 12-hour cycles. They are able to respond very quickly. The FEMA model is 12-person for this type of team. A regional team would be 3 deep in these positions. We would want to locate each one of these teams in a current emergency management region, which we'll see in the next slide. If we look at this in emergency management, these are the 10 areas. If we could establish this program, we'd be able to have a team in every emergency management district that would cover the state of Kentucky. These will be our responders that will make the first initial contact. So, for example, with flooding in eastern Kentucky that happened, that's our most recent. Instead of a call being made to a mutual aid fire department to ask for assistance, they can go through their emergency management region offices to be able to get those regional teams quicker and faster to get those trained professionals in there to make rescues. So, always the big question, how much would a USAR program cost the Commonwealth of Kentucky? We took into consideration the following guidelines. We followed the FEMA, the SUSAR, which is the State Urban Search and Rescue Program, NFPA, which is National Fire Protection Association, and VMAPPS guidelines. Realistic times for developing and training, equipment and fleet, current supply chains, and the geographics of Kentucky. We found that an overall cost of about $26 million is what it would take to form these teams. we wanted to split these over what you see here. Year one, $12 million, almost $13 million. In year two, another $13 million, with year three and years four being maintenance years or maintenance costs for those teams for years after that.
When would Kentucky expect to see deployable teams? That's the ultimate question we have to ask ourselves. The projected timeline for Kentucky USAR program would be year one is establish the USAR program first. Then once we establish the program, we would establish the 5 deployable regional teams. We looked at, of the 10 regional teams that we would have, we decided that the first 5 teams would be far western Kentucky and then far eastern part of the state. Those reasons is because most of our larger cities are in the center part of the state. Kentucky Task Force 1 and 2 would be deployable on a limited basis, and advanced training would be given to the membership. On year 2, established the 5 remaining regional teams. Kentucky Task Force 1 and 2 will be fully deployable. Advanced training for the membership will continue, and we would start the annual 3-day mobilization exercises across the state. We have a couple scenarios to give you in closing. First scenario is a tornado has touched down in the western part of the state. The local jurisdiction responds and determines that a need for their regional team is needed. They need assistance. The state EOC is notified. They issue a state incident number. The state EOC, along with the regional team, notifies the Kentucky USAR command staff of an incident. Once the regional team arrives on scene, the leadership will perform a size-up of the incident and request additional regional teams or task forces if needed. The Kentucky USAR command staff will then have regional teams and task forces dispatched to the appropriate areas. Our second scenario is that the reports are from local and state meteorologists that the potential for heavy rains and flooding are issued for a part of the state. Kentucky USAR would place regional teams in that part of the state in the closest task force on alert. They would start to pre-roster a team. Local and regional EM directors may request for a Type 2 water rescue regional team or multiple to stage in an area. This will prevent delays in a response, and a state incident number would start to be created. Once the local jurisdiction has become unable to support the mission, they can request for response from the regional team. In the last scenario, a Category 4 hurricane is predicted to make landfall in 3 days. The state of Alabama has requested the following from the state of Kentucky through EMAC, which EMAC is the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, which is their state-to-state mutual aid agreement. They requested for 1 Type 3 USAR team and 4 Type 2 Swiftwater teams. The state of Kentucky accepts the request and deploys the needed resources to assist their state in their needs.
So before we go into questions, one of the reasons that we're looking at this, we want to make sure that we have a coordinated attack, a coordinated effort anytime something happens, a disaster happens within the Commonwealth. The creation of this program will allow us to have that coordinated area. It wouldn't require certain fire departments or certain communities to call on their friends, their neighbors beside us. It would automatically be a thing that would be in the process and working and allow the state to be covered. So once again, I'd like to thank you for giving us the opportunity and time to come in here and talk about the USAR initiative, and we'll be more than happy to take any questions that you may have. And
just real quick, one of the key reasons that we need this team in the state of Kentucky is rapid deployment. Due to the constraints of communications and everything, when the disaster hit in eastern Kentucky, it was almost 12 hours before some of these teams were able to get boots on the ground to assist the fire departments in the communities that were calling for the assistance. With this type of approach and with this type of organization, we could theoretically have boots on the ground in an hour. And that's what everybody needs to think of, because we could have saved lives in eastern Kentucky with the flood, because with the flood, you've got rising waters. Even though it was a flash flood, you had people that were able to hold on in areas that they couldn't. If we could have got teams in there in 6 hours, we could have saved lives. So that's what we need to, although there is a dollar amount to this, that's the one thing I want to emphasize to everybody. this is needed because it will save lives, no doubt about it. With that, we'll take any questions anybody might have.